So again, learn the differences between what official sources are and unofficial sources. Very important. Again, what's propaganda, what's actually good information, and there is a lot of good Chinese information that's out there. Get a WeChat account, which is, WeChat is the biggest Chinese social network in the world. You have to, it runs differently than Facebook and WhatsApp and others, and you will, they have English, it's in English, but then you'll join groups in Chinese, but they also have all of their, you can translate a lot of their stuff, and also understand what the different editorial standards are of the different outlets. A lot of people will look at all Chinese media as being the same. And just like in Zimbabwe, just like in South Africa, just like in the US, some are different than others. So understanding what they are, and some are more extreme and more accurate and balanced. So understanding who they are. Okay, so one of the things that we do at the China Africa Project is we will take Chinese media from WeChat, we'll take it, we'll take policy papers, and we will either translate it or we will contextualize it. So sometimes we won't do a word for word translation, but we'll just tell people, here's what's going on. We also showcase kind of social media influencers. We'll showcase, what people do. So you'll see in the middle part where the Chinese characters are, that was a story about the mining companies and the controversy in the DRC. Now, the story itself was kind of lame. It was just boring propaganda. What it was interesting is that we found was one of the comments in there was from a Chinese man who had lived in the Congo, understood how everything worked. And he wrote this really detailed comment about, how the Chinese do business in the DR Congo. That is the interesting part. And that's what we pulled out and we give to our readers. And so we do a lot of that. And so that's what, again, that's the exercise that more African journalists should be doing, is that you can work with Chinese, you can find local Chinese, you can find people to help you with this. But this is what is to understand more of what Chinese media beyond the official media is doing. But that's something really important to do. Chinese Twitter in Africa is really big and really popular. So I have sent you this deck, and this is the Twitter list. I have a list of every single Chinese diplomat and Chinese embassy that's on Twitter, and especially in Zimbabwe, there is a lot of good information. We had a situation a couple of years ago in Zimbabwe where the Zimbabwean, or the president's office had miscounted some of the aid that China gave. And then it was very funny because rather than just pick up the phone between the two, the Chinese embassy and the Zimbabwean government got into a big public Twitter fight, and they were just going back and forth on Twitter. But a lot of news in Africa about the Chinese happens on Twitter. So to follow my list and then to follow other Chinese influencers in Africa is a great way of developing sources and getting good information about what the Chinese are doing in Africa. And there's quite a bit. And you can follow me as well. I've put my Twitter name there. And I only tweet on China Africa Matters. So every day I'm putting out maybe 20 to 30 different stories, and I have discussions going on China Africa issues. So, and a lot of it is Zimbabwe, so you can find information there.
Eric, just a quick question on that one. The issue of perception, you're saying it would be very valuable for you to reach out and create contacts, source contacts, info contacts, from China. But then when we started, you were talking about propaganda, and we know that this is the main thrust of Chinese reporting, that information with the purpose. Now, my question is around the issue of perception. Now, if I'm a private or independent journalist from Zimbabwe, for instance, how easy or how difficult then would it be for me to get contact from China who could easily share information for me?
It's not easy. None of this is easy. I won't pretend that it's easy. It's hard, and it takes time, and it is there's a big culture gap. There's a big language gap, but it can be done. And you can find, again, through Twitter and locally. And again, there's a difference between official sources and non-official sources. So official sources are going to be the embassy, Xinhua, you know, of state-owned enterprise, state-owned companies. Those are going to be the official sources. Those are important to cultivate as well. It's important to understand what the official sources are saying. But it's also important to get to know some of the workers and the project managers at the companies. There's a lot of private companies in Zimbabwe. Huawei, Transsin, BYD. BYD is now selling electric vehicles in Harare for the first time. You know, get to know the manager of the BYD dealership that's there. Why did they pick to sell EVs in Zimbabwe ahead of almost any other country in Africa, which is incredible? So there's a wide range of stakeholders. I would really urge you also to be careful of the word Chinese, okay? The word Chinese is just as bad as the word African, okay? Because tell me who an African is. Africa is 1.2 billion people, 54 countries. Are we talking about somebody from Tunisia? Are we talking about somebody from Libya? Are we talking about somebody from Mali? So it's so diverse, so big, and the Chinese are the same way. So a lot of people will say Chinese, and that's all encompassing for everything. And there's a lot of difference in between of the different groups and who they are and the different levels that they're at, official, non-official. So, but the most important thing is that you start down a road and a pathway to start understanding who they are, what they're doing, what's the difference between them. So you understand that not all Chinese are the same in that sense, and start to really and that will help you write better news about the Chinese and to better understand what is good information and what is bad information.
Thank you. Let me ask the participants whether they've got questions. But apparently Eric is coming to the close of his presentation. Any questions relating to his presentation? Yeah, there's Nkosana. Nkosana, can you fire away? Sure.
Okay. I just wanted to understand, we as Africans, with this perception that the Chinese are not good in Africa in terms of their investments. So essentially, it's a very positive story about Chinese investments, especially in Africa. And if there is, then to what extent is that the case? Because the impression is that the Chinese are out to exploit. The Chinese are out to do the recolonization of Africa. So what's the positive story about African Chinese investments in Africa?
Okay, I'm glad you brought up the colonization kind of story. I cannot more firmly reject the idea that China is out to colonize Africa, and I'll tell you why. And this is a problem that I think, again, it comes back to this instinct that is so common in Africa, that everybody who is not Black African is white. And they are all the same. And so we're folding the Chinese into what Europeans did in Africa. So the Chinese are doing lots and lots and lots of bad things in Zimbabwe and in Africa. You can see about the treatment of workers. You can see about the environmental degradation. You can see about corruption. Lots of bad things are happening. No doubt. We can spend all the time for the rest of our discussion talking about the bad things that are happening. But when we use the word colonization, okay, that's a very particular word. And what, in my view, is that weakens what real colonialism in Africa was like. Real colonialism by the Europeans in Africa, as you all know, was violent, was horrific, was theft, was murder. It was all-encompassing. You had to learn to speak English, believe in Christianity. They redrew the borders. They made you go to school in different languages. They made you wear different clothes. They cut off limbs. They started wars. The list of horrific things that real colonialism did was incredible. That no one is putting a gun to anybody's head in Africa to take a Chinese loan. Nobody is putting a gun to anybody's head to build for the Chinese to come in and loan you money to build a railway. That's not colonialism. So I think we need to get away from framing this in a European context, because that is the problem. You cannot look at the Chinese as whites. You can't look at the Chinese like you've looked at the Europeans and the Americans. They're playing by a completely different set of rules. And one of the problems in Africa today, and this is a very serious problem, is that African governments are sitting down across from the negotiating table from the Chinese, thinking, as your question just did, that these are white people. These are Europeans. I'm going to talk to these guys the same way I talk to the French, the Americans, and the British. And they're getting played. You know, when we look at the loan contracts, we have research now coming out about the loan contracts. These loan contracts that your government and Zambia and DRC and Kenya and Ethiopia have all got in. And one of the things we're learning is that the African negotiators who are sitting across the table from the Chinese come from the Ministry of Finance, maybe a mid-level to a senior level Ministry of Finance person who doesn't have any experience dealing with the Chinese. You know what the Chinese did? They were flying in lawyers at $500 an hour from New York and London to sit on the other side of that. And they completely took these guys for a ride. The African side too often just does not understand who they are dealing with. And as a result of that, they're getting the short end of the deal. Part of that is because of this mindset that the Chinese are simply an extension of the Europeans who are trying to colonize Africa. That's point number one. Point number two, your biggest challenge right now about the Chinese in Africa is not that they are going to take over Africa. Okay? Let me just make this super clear. Africans and Africa as a whole has always framed itself in its importance in the international order is because of its economic value. Because that's the way that the Europeans and the whites told you what you're worth in this world. They said your only value to the international community is the resources that you have. That's how many Africans think of themselves, is their country's value in the world is because we have natural resources. Now, to the Chinese, remember, Africa does not matter at all to the Chinese, economically speaking. I cannot emphasize this enough. That total African trade with China last year was $187 billion. Now, for Africa, that's a lot of money. That makes China the largest trading partner of any country in the world, okay? But for China that did $4.34 trillion in trade last year, 187 billion is literally the money they find in their pockets. It's less than 4% of the total global trade that China did last year. So China does twice as much trade with South America. It does more trade with the Middle East. It does $1.2 trillion of trade with where I'm at here in Southeast Asia. So, 6 times as much as it does with Africa. Africa, in fact, is the least important trading region in the world for China. Okay, so economically speaking, not important at all to China. In fact, Africa could disappear tomorrow, they wouldn't even notice it. And most of the timber, oil, and minerals that China buys from Africa, it can buy from other points on the Belt and Road today. South America, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Pacific, all of that is now available for them. So they don't really need, except the cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. That is the only resource in Africa today that China really needs from the continent, pretty much everything else. So if economically speaking, Africa is not important to China, and here's the interesting thing. It's not about money, it's about politics today. Why do you think that China is sold 12 million vaccines to Zimbabwe today, more than any other country in sub-Saharan Africa? It's not because other countries in sub-Saharan Africa don't have the money to pay the Chinese. They could have given the vaccines or sold the vaccines to any country. But it's politics that's the most important thing. Africa's votes at the UN, Africa's use of Huawei, Africa's support for the Chinese at the IMF, at the Food and Agriculture Organization, at the World Health Organization. to slap back the Americans, to slap back the Europeans, to adopt the Chinese way of doing things. That is where the story is, not on the resources. They genuinely could not care less about the resources. It's a small part of what they're doing around the world. So we got to change the narrative. Again, this is getting out of this colonial mentality of recolonizing Africa. The Chinese, your biggest problem is not, again, that the Chinese are going to colonize Africa. Your biggest problem is they get bored and they leave. And that's what's happening now. We've seen the financing for infrastructure now go from hundreds of billions to almost nothing now from the Chinese. They're not interested in financing African infrastructure anymore. There's fewer people coming from China to Africa. There's fewer trade. They're going to parts of the world that are more stable, that are less hassling, that are easier to deal with. They're shifting their oil buys to the Middle East. They're doing more sourcing from Brazil and South America. So your bigger problem is not that they're going to conquer Africa, but that they're going to leave and get bored. And then what they're going to do instead is they're going to focus on Mnangagwa and the 10 people around Mnangagwa to make sure that they get their politics all sorted out, and that's the end of it. That's been the change that we are seeing today. So it's very different than the story that most people think about the Chinese in Africa.
Yeah, and I think that you would never overstate your last point around the Chinese intentions in Africa, Zimbabwe included, where you see so much sensitivity. Say, for instance, when local journalists write in a should I say negativist way about say Chinese vaccine interventions in Zimbabwe. Now that's one narrative that has tended to attract a lot of negative energy from officialdom, where all the time the private media in Zimbabwe write critically about the vaccination program or the rollout of the vaccines into Zimbabwe. You see the energy from officialdom. So yeah, that's a very important.
Yeah, and one thing you got to worry about in Zimbabwe in particular is that many people, and this happens in other African countries as well, is they will criticize the Chinese because the Chinese have a close relationship with Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF. And so what they will end up doing is that they're not always criticizing the Chinese. They're criticizing ZANU and they're criticizing Mnangagwa because of the close relationship between the two. And so you have to sometimes separate. When you see Zim-I and you see some of the other the negative news coverage, you think, are they really criticizing the Chinese or are they going after ZANU? And so that because the press in Zimbabwe is very polarized between pro and anti-ZANU-PF, that the Chinese get folded up into that. That happens a lot, for example, in Zambia as well, where people were going after Edgar Lungu. But the problem with Lungu is that he had a tendency of throwing his critics in jail and killing his critics. So they would then go after the Chinese, and they know the Chinese would not push back. But by going after the Chinese, you're going after Lungu implicitly. And that happens in many African countries too. I see that happen quite a bit in Zimbabwe as well.
Any questions from the floor? Yes, Steven.
Eric, I think you brought in a very important point, especially in terms of changing the narrative from resources to actually power and politics, and at UN. But don't you think it's also a propaganda? Because if you look at it, the Chinese who go effectively, they will feed that and continue to feed that as news, especially on the African continent. And we are moving to writing stories with that angle. Don't you think it's a propaganda that they are using? Because we are not also fixing what's actually the statistics that you brought in are quite interesting.
Twanda, I didn't quite hear that. If you could just summarize it for me, that would be great.
I'm going to ask him to research a question because I didn't quite.
I didn't quite understand it. I couldn't hear it very clearly. That's the only problem.
So you can come up. So just a moment.
Yes, it comes right there. They go. Come close to the microphone. Hello.
Yeah. What I'm saying, Eric, is you brought in a very interesting angle to the whole story of reporting on China, and especially for us to shift from the resources to the power narrative, the politics that is happening right now. And I was saying that isn't it the Chinese are using it the resource narrative as a propaganda tool, so as to hoodwink, even the African journalists.
No, the Chinese narrative. It's a great question, and it's much easier to understand by coming up there. The Chinese want to downplay the resource relationship, because remember, and this is something that a lot of Africans are not aware of, China was colonized by the same countries that colonized you. The British, the French, the Portuguese, the Germans, they all colonized China too. So China will come at the resource angle saying, we too are the victims of European colonialism, just like you. And the resource extraction looks a little bit too much like European colonialism. So that's one of the things that you hear about the Chinese, is that they're talking about Huawei telecom, they're talking about vaccines, they're talking about infrastructure, they're talking about agricultural development, they're talking about all the education scholarships that are available in China. So they like to put this, what they call a win-win. So they will make the Chinese market available, but they don't really want to talk about the resources that much, only because it looks too much like the colonialism that they too say, and they're right, that they were the victims of, just like African countries. And again, remember that China and Africa both were the victims of colonialism. And it wasn't that long ago. We're talking about 100, 150 years ago. So in the space of history, obviously in Africa, it was less than that 50 or 60 years ago. But the colonialism was relatively recent. And so they would like to make sure that they don't fall into the same category as the Europeans in terms of resource extraction. So I think that they try and spin you away from that, when in fact, here's the reality, that of the $187 billion of trade, only 10 countries occupy the bulk of that. So about 45 other countries do very little trade with China. That is, they buy a lot, but they don't sell very much. So one of the things you see, Senegal, I haven't seen Zambia's, but I can look, probably the same in Zambia, is you have tens of millions of dollars of exports and billions of dollars of imports. That is something that the Chinese government does not like to talk about very often. So the trade is not spread out evenly, and that is getting more extreme because they are focusing on very expensive resources like oil and diamonds and things like that that are in certain, only a select few countries. One very quick thing before we go, because I'm sure somebody might ask this, is about the debt trap. And we hear a lot about Chinese debt in Africa. Let me just be the first person to tell you that Africa as a continent does not have a Chinese debt problem. And people will think, what? What are you talking about? Of course they have a Chinese debt problem. About 10 countries have a Chinese debt problem in Africa. Angola, Ethiopia, Zambia, Djibouti, Kenya, for the most part. But that means 40 to 45 other countries in Africa do not have a Chinese debt problem. So again, be very careful. I talked about the propaganda from China that you have to be careful of. You also have to be careful of a lot of the narratives that are coming out of the West. And you will hear the West talk about Africa as one thing. And a lot of the anti-China content that comes out of the US in particular, or in Europe too, you have to be just as skeptical of. And that's, I think that's also very important.
Okay, so one question before we go for the tea break. Eric, and maybe the floor can also come in. What would you say? You know, because we've got so many years focusing your reportage around Chinese dynamics in Africa in this particular regard. But what would you say are the main or recurrent themes that come out of the news? You know, what excites the news at a thematic level?
So what excites the news is the questions of colonization, of debt traps, of Chinese labor abuse, you know, the videos of Chinese managers beating up local employees. That gets tons and tons. I mean, that is what people gets very excited. The difficult part for us as journalists is to put those events in the proper context. So not to suggest that the videos of Chinese bosses or Chinese environmental abuses or Chinese degradation, because what that does is it plays into the insecurities that many Africans have that they are being recolonized by another foreign power. So that's one of the reasons why on social media you will see so much kind of energy or excitement about this, is because people will say, here it is again. I know what this story is. Again, my point is not that the Chinese are not doing bad things, because they are doing bad things. It's just not colonialism. And that's a really important thing to separate. The problem is that when you bring a nuanced, complex argument to a story to say, but wait, there's more to this story, people aren't as interested. If I tell you that the Chinese are colonizing Africa and there's a debt trap and they're abusing local employees, boom, you'll get a lot of traffic. Because that's what people really want. So the challenge is to make the stories exciting and interesting, but also to take that information and put it in the proper context. I recommend that the only way to do it is you just got to learn. There's no shortcuts here. You just have to learn about these issues, find lots of different sources. We have a free podcast. You can listen to us. You can follow me on Twitter. You have my email address. So any questions that anybody in the group has, I love having these conversations. You can call me up and say, can I have a chat? Do you know people I can speak with? I love connecting our sources and our experts to other journalists, and they like it because they get exposure. So I'm happy to make everything that we have available. We have 600 guests on our podcast on our website. You can go through that and you can send me an email saying, Eric, can you connect me with this person? And I will be happy to give you their email address. So that is a very good way to do this, to get started on your journey to better understand what the Chinese are doing.
Oh, thanks a lot. Any other question before we break? You don't have questions. Okay, so our guys there saying they don't have questions, not at this particular time. So, but then of course
you can email me anything later too.
Yeah, you shared your contact details. So I think those interested in that, because we'll be producing content now after this training intervention. So
fantastic.
Yeah, they'll be in touch. I would also be in touch.
Thank you, Tawana, and thank you to the group for the opportunity to talk with you about this. I hope we have a chance to stay in touch. Again, please accept my invitation that anytime you would like to speak or you have questions, just email me or we can set up a time to talk. But I wish you the very best in your training session.
Many thanks, Eric, for coming over, right?
Okay. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Yeah.